and thank you very much for joining us today for this very special event entitled The Sustainable Mobility Transformation, Green and Just, with a question mark at the end of that title, which will be an all-important question mark, as will become apparent over the next 90 minutes or so. My name is Joe Miller. I am the correspondent at the Financial Times based in Frankfurt, from where I cover the European auto industry as a whole, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session today. Before we move on to our packed program, I just want to run through some basic bits of housekeeping. Firstly, I'd like to draw your attention briefly to the schedule for this morning. So after a short introduction from myself, we'll hear from Torsten Muschal, CLEPA's president, and an executive vice president at auto supplier Faurecia. After that, we'll move to our keynote speech, for which we're delighted to welcome EU Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Nicholas Schmit, and a presentation from PwC's Henning Rennert, who has conducted strong analysis on the electric transition's impact on the automotive supplier workforce, will follow that. And then at the end, we will end with a lively panel discussion with insights from keen observers of the auto industry's transition, more of which later. At any point throughout the keynote speech and the panel discussion, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screens to ask questions. Time permitting, I'll put these questions to our guests and panelists, and please don't be shy. The purpose of such events is to have an honest and rigorous discussion, so please do use that box and ask away. And finally, please do spread the word about this event and the topics we'll be discussing. You can use the hashtag Green and Just, or one word, on social media such as Twitter and LinkedIn. Now, onto today's timely topic. The ambition is clear and it's shared by almost all, and that's to reach climate neutrality in Europe by 2050. However, the roadmap to get there and how to achieve the interim target of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, that's still being drawn up, and decisions made in the next few months will reverberate throughout Europe's economies and societies for many decades to come. Nowhere are these decisions more crucial than in the transport sector. As we know, the movement of people and goods on roads is responsible for roughly a fifth of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions, and that share has been growing since 1990, not shrinking. And the pandemic has, of course, only seen an increase on our reliance on goods delivered by road, and certainly I'm particularly reliant on parcels delivered by road. And it's unrealistic to expect that we'll see fewer cars, vans and trucks on the streets in the near future, perhaps with the exception of a few residential areas, which leaves Europe and the rest of the world with one option really, which is to minimize the impact of road transport on the environment using whatever means necessary. Now, thanks to technological advancements, many of which actually have their roots in the auto industry, there is much more reason for hope than despair. It's entirely possible, for example, to imagine European cities with vastly reduced pollution from tailpipe emissions within the next decade, for example. It also won't be long before the sales of battery electric vehicles overtake diesel models in Europe. In fact, I imagine we're getting some news on that as we get 2021 sales figures in the next few weeks. And battery electric vehicles will almost certainly become mainstream in countries with viable charging infrastructures. The problem, though, is how quickly all this can be achieved while keeping the fabric of democratic societies intact. And that's an urgent question which CLEPA, which represents more than 3,000 companies in the European auto supply chain, has been trying to address. And as you saw in those slides at the beginning, currently around 600,000 jobs in the EU rely on the production of the internal combustion engine, and a recent study by PwC Strategy and on behalf of CLEPA, which we'll hear more about later, found that the approach currently taken by the Commission's Fit for 55 package, so the de facto ban on petrol and on new petrol and diesel cars, I should say, by 2035, will put over 500,000 of those jobs at risk. And while some auto manufacturers like VW have played down the transition's impact on employment, this concern over mass job losses has been voiced by leading industry figures such as Carlos Tavares at Stellantis, for example, and other large tier 1 suppliers like Continental. And they've been urging lawmakers to consider climate goals and social goals in tandem, not to destroy an industry that acts as the cornerstone of many European communities and spends more on research and development than any other economic sector in the EU. And then there are those who worry that battery vehicles are being promoted at the expense of other technologies, such as hydrogen, for example, and that a lack of investment in the next generation of petrol and diesel engines will leave those unable or unwilling to buy an electric car driving far dirtier models than would otherwise be necessary. Which leads me on to the very apt title for this session. As will become clear over the next 90 minutes or so, it's impossible to discuss the positive impact of technological progress on our climate without addressing the impact it could have on industry, on innovation, and on employment. Our economies have already been battered by COVID-19, and only once support from governments and central banks begins to ease will the true damage caused by the pandemic probably become evident and the scale of the repair job necessary become apparent. And so with elections coming up in France and Hungary, to name just 2 countries, and energy costs soaring, we can expect debates about the consequences of pursuing various green policies at a time of such turmoil to be front and center. And just as Britain and Germany's divergent strategies for phasing out coal mining, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, had repercussions that are still being felt until this day. The extent to which the world is able to reduce carbon emissions from transport, from the cars we all drive, while ensuring that societies are not diminished, will, I personally have no doubt, be one of the ways in which we all assess the legacy of today's political class and indeed our captains of industry. So I'm looking forward to hear about some of the ways in which our speakers and panelists think a sustainable future for the auto sector can be achieved, but that's more than enough for me. I'll now pass over the floor to CLEPA's president, Torsten Michel. The floor is yours, Torsten.
Thank you for that introduction, Joe. Good morning to all of you. I would also like to thank Commissioner Schmidt in advance and all the panelists for their contributions, and of course the participants who have joined to listen into this discussion this morning. As we know, reaching climate neutrality in the European area by 2050 requires ambitious emission reductions. This requires a massive transformation for the automotive industry and its supply chain. It will have a major impact not only on employment, but also on consumer choices, the affordability of individual mobility, and the European competitiveness. The face of the industry will change as a result of the transition to electronic powertrains, requiring the restructuring of production sites and the workforce. We as CLEPA fully support the objectives of the Green Deal. In fact, automotive suppliers design and manufacture today all of the components and systems that are needed to achieve to make mobility safe, smart, and sustainable. This is today already the case. Our members invest today already heavily in new technologies and are leaders of the innovation. However, it's imperative that we understand the impact of this transformation for the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of people working today hard to deliver these technical solutions for sustainable mobility. It is important that we have this dialogue early with the relevant policymakers. Along the way, let me share also a few key numbers. Some of them have been mentioned by Joe already. The auto sector is directly responsible for more than 8.6% of the overall manufacturing employment, with more than 60% of the workers employed by automotive suppliers. This means more than 1.7 million direct jobs in the supplier industry. Of course, 1.7 million equals 600,000, or roughly 1/3. All these people are depending, 1/3 is depending on internal combustion engine technology today. The study about to be presented by Henning from PwC is the first of its kind in evaluating the impact of different pathways to reach Green Deal objectives with a focus on automotive suppliers. It provides a European-wide assessment of the impact on the employment in our sector and it further identifies the risks, but also the opportunities in 7 major production countries for the automotive components. We as CLEPA believe that a successful transformation starts with knowing the stakes. Obviously, emissions have to go down, no question, and we fully support an accelerated electrification as a part of the solution. But we also need a transformation that is both green and just, both together. The automotive supplier industry is deeply connected with regional economies, composed out of global suppliers, as well as many innovative, smaller companies and SMEs. It is critical that we put automotive suppliers in front when managing the social and economic impact of this transformation. We altogether would be very wise to ensure that the transformation happens in a technology open, effective and efficient manner. Altogether, we have to reduce CO2 emissions in Europe, not only in Europe, also globally. And we will need both an accelerated electrification and an advanced clean combustion technology in all different shapes that hybrids can come in and can play a role, and as well in the form of hydrogen solutions also. We have the technology in Europe, and we have a competitive advantage with our supplier base. We would be doing ourselves a disservice not to leverage it in the future. To be clear, our mutual objective is to reduce emissions and to reach climate neutral mobility. But we also need to be realistic about the uncertainties surrounding this effort, especially as it pertains to an electric vehicle only approach. We are asking that industry and society have sufficient time to manage the social aspects of this transformation, of this transition. We are asking also that all technology solutions have its place in reducing emissions. This will also help to sustain the competitiveness in the global market and maintain employment in Europe, which is key for our society. Thanks for your attention, and I now hand back over to Joe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Torsten. We'll now move on to this morning's keynote speech, for which I'm delighted to welcome Nicholas Schmidt. Nicholas Schmidt, for those of you who don't know, is the European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, whose mission is to strengthen Europe's social dimension and ensure that the bloc continues to be a place where dignified and fair employment is available to all, even as we undergo a series of unprecedented technological shifts. Mr. Schmidt, thank you for joining us this morning to share your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe, for giving me the floor, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. So I thank CLEPA very much for inviting me, because as it has been just said by Thorsten, it is a fundamental issue now to deal with sustainable mobility. And we all are aware of the big transformation this implies for the European industry. And I can just support what has been said on the numbers. I think the automotive sector in general represents a big deal, still a big deal of European total employment, and especially also of the employment of the manufacturing sector. So I think this is an important element. And when we are talking about this transition has to be green, obviously, but it has to be fair and just, because otherwise we will be confronted with a certain number of other issues, political issues, which would then represent a threat to this necessary green transition. We are all aware that greenhouse gas emissions need to be urgently reduced for the EU to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And our Fit for 55 package aims to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. This is, without any doubt, ambitious, very ambitious. Although this transition to climate neutrality will create also opportunities, many opportunities, it is also going to disrupt our economy, and especially a certain number of sectors which will be at the heart of this transition and also have an impact on our labor markets. The green transition will only be successful, and I can only repeat that and support what has been said previously, if fairness, solidarity, and especially also social measures are at its heart. So workers need support to adapt and change jobs, and companies, enterprises have to be supported also to adapt, innovate, and reinforce their technological capacities. To respond to these challenges, the Commission presented a proposal for a Council recommendation on ensuring a fair transition to climate neutrality last month. And this proposal provides concrete guidance to member states on how to address the relevant employment and social aspects of the green transition. It also puts people at the heart of the green transition. I want also to insist on the importance of social dialogue at all levels, not only at the European level, at the national level, but also in this transformation process at the level of companies. We can only be able, and companies can only be able to positively go through this transformation if they take along all stakeholders, including obviously the workers and their representatives. With the right policies, the green transition should create 1 million jobs in the EU by 2030. But this does not happen automatically or by default, and some industrial ecosystems and regions will be more affected than others. And this requires policymakers and social partners to work together and provide pathways towards a sustainable transition. The Commission welcomes CLEPA's recently published study on the impact of the green transition on the automotive value chain. As highlighted in our proposal for a Council recommendation, we must produce precise forecasts regarding the employment, social, and distributional impacts of this green transition. As described by CLEPA's study, Europe is on a transition path towards increased electromobility. And in the automotive sector, this means that European demand is shifting away from combustion engines towards battery cell engines. And this is certainly a major transformation, but it's a transformation which is a must, a necessity, because when we look around, when we look the major competitors, countries, but also companies, we see that there is a growing interest, a growing strength of this electromobility, and especially some companies, I need not mention, you know them, who have really focused on this electromobility. And this evolution will result in significant workforce reductions in the automotive sector across the EU. Suppliers and service providers will need to adjust their business models and undertake an enormous effort for reskilling their workers to remain competitive. But I want to mention also in this context the positive sides. And I think especially the importance of the setting up of a European battery industry. I have the impression that this has taken some time, perhaps a bit too much time, to develop this European battery industry. But now I think with the European Alliance on batteries, things are moving. And I think the first major European battery plant has started its production. This is key because we all know that batteries are an important and a major component of an electric car, and therefore it's key for Europe to be very present on this in this industry. First, because this industry, if we are really developing it as it is foreseen in the European Alliance, will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. This needs also a vast enterprise of reskilling, upskilling, or just skilling people for these new technologies. And also, I want to say that having the control of this technology, which is also evolving in Europe, is also a central element of keeping a strong automotive industry in Europe. And when we are debating now about the autonomy of Europe, the strategic autonomy in a more industrial strategic approach, we see, especially in sectors like the semiconductors, when Europe is depending too much on external providers, that this may become a weakness. And therefore, I think the EU battery strategy and alliance is key also for employment, but also for the further development of a strong automotive industry in Europe. Training and participation over the last decade has not kept up with the rapid pace of change in our economy. And the ambitious transitions we are confronted with, green and digital, simply mean we need a paradigm shift in skills policies. And this applies particularly to the automotive sectors and also to new production capacities like the batteries I just mentioned. EU member states on average invest 4.6% of GDP in education and training, but only 0.5% of their GDP goes towards developing adult skills. And this is obviously not enough. In response, the 2020 European Skills Agenda aims to empower individuals to learn new skills to meet the needs of employers. And the Pact for Skills is one of its flagship initiatives. It mobilizes private, public, and social partners to take concrete actions for the up and reskilling of Europe's workforce. In 2021, 6 partnerships, including the automotive sector, have already been established, committing to the up and reskilling of 1.5 million people. And the Pact for Skills automotive sector partnership is one of the pioneers with the ambition to upskill 5% of the workforce in this sector each year. And I applaud your ambition and assure you that the Commission stands ready to support your efforts. And this is also an important dimension, the financial dimension, how we will be able to support financially this major enterprise. And I think here we all think about the recovery and resilience facility, which can be used, but also certainly in the context of the financial means of the ESF, and also other means based like the lending of European money to the financing of the reskilling should be seriously envisaged. Crucially, the Commission is also launching a European approach for individual learning accounts and micro-credentials. The automotive sector in Europe will need to undertake a major re- and upskilling exercise in the coming decades. This is a significant undertaking, as the automotive industry estimates that 700,000 workers per year will need to be reskilled to manage the green and digital transition from 25 onwards. And to that end, the Commission has presented a proposal on setting up individual learning accounts to provide training entitlements for all adults of working age. The proposal will support member states to empower individuals and make the individual right to adult learning tangible for them through a combination of financial support for training and other types of support, in particular, career guidance, validation, and more transparency about training importance. And this new normal, where adults need to regularly acquire new skills, means making sure that they have access to new forms of quality training opportunities tailored to their needs, equipping them for labor market success. Micro-credentials, already widely used, will also support this objective of having the targeted and flexible upskilling and reskilling needed in the twin transitions. Building on servicing electric vehicles, for example, calls for reskilling today and micro-credentials are one way to ensure that this happens. Through the recommendation, we aim to define a common approach to micro-credentials to increase trust and transparency of micro-credentials and harness their full potential. To conclude, the transition to a carbon neutral economy and a greener automotive sector will not be automatic, and I would even say will not be so easy. Therefore, new active labor market measures are required to help workers and companies adapt to the greening of the economy. The automotive sector will be on the cusp of these challenges. Our initiatives will support giving workers the right skills to seize the new opportunities created by green and digital transitions. And especially, we have really to organize the transitions from jobs which will disappear to new jobs in the economy, sometimes out of the automotive sector, sometimes also inside this sector. I just read that a big automotive company that suppressed about, I think, 6,000 jobs due to this transition to electromobility is creating now 6,000 jobs precisely to develop and produce electric cars. So these are complex transitions which have to be organized, accompanied, and also supported, including supported financially. So I count further on a strong cooperation, especially with CLEPA, to make this transition a success, to make this transition fair, just, and also to support the innovation. And I think the automotive sector is really a sector that has proven its innovative capacity, and this innovative capacity is more than needed in the future to make the transition not just fair, but also successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Commissioner Schmidt. Incredible insights that have prompted quite a discussion from our audience. Unfortunately, time is against us, but I can't let you go without a very quick question. You mentioned batteries, for example, and various other green shoots that this Fit for 55 will bring up in the auto industry and create new jobs, and that's undoubtedly true. But I wondered, for those highly specialized companies and SMEs that are involved in the internal combustion engine, is there any hope for those companies for maintaining employment in those companies?
There's a question to me.
That is a question to you. Yeah, quick question, a brief one.
Well, you know that in our economic life, you have a cycle of life for products, and unfortunately, maybe this cycle of life cycle of the combustion engine is coming to an end. I think we have to accept this, because we see that all over the world now electromobility is the dominating trend. And I think this is for many companies focused on the combustion engine, this is a big challenge. But I think there is a possibility, and there are already cases, how companies can adapt and can also enter into new fields of technologies, because very often they are very innovative companies with a strong and high level of technological capacities. So I would say the word is now adaptation, innovation, and based on the awareness that there is a certain life cycle for one technology is coming to an end. This is a fact, and I would just encourage companies in that sense to adapt their industrial strategies, and obviously in that context we have to support them, through investment, but also through reskilling of their workforce.
Well, as I say, we could continue talking about this for ages. It's a fascinating topic, but the clock is against us. So it just remains for me to thank you very much for your time this morning and for being with us for this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Well, now we move on to a presentation by Henning Rennert of PwC. Henning is a partner at PwC's Strategy and he led the team, conducted the analysis on the EV transition's impact on the automotive supplier workforce, which we've mentioned a few times. This was a first of its kind study looking on a very granular level at what the impact of 3 different market scenarios would be on employment and the prospects of the automotive supply industry in general in several key European markets, which I'm sure Henning will elaborate on. Questions, as always, are welcome. Please use the chat box at the bottom of your screens as Henning is talking. But for now, the floor is yours, Henning.
Thank you very much, Joe. Really, it's an honor to speak to you today about the impact of the automotive powertrain electrification on value add and employment. And that is really differentiating about that study. Thanks to the national associations, thanks to all the member companies, and thanks to the CLEPA at the forefront for this great collaboration. Let me guide you in the next 10 minutes through our study. It's a very quick walk, just an appetizer. You can download the complete study on the CLEPA webpage. And please move to the next page, please. The EV transition changes the powertrain employment structure and value add level in Europe significantly. The automotive industry in Europe stands for 2.9 million employees, 1.7 with suppliers. And we look in this study on those 645,000 employed in automotive powertrain. The study analyzes the employment impact in 3 distinctively different market scenarios: a so-called mixed technology scenario, a EV-only scenario, and a so-called radical scenario. EV-only represents the current Fit for 55 plan of the European Commission most accurately. There are 275,000 jobs at risk. Without employment opportunities driven by electrification, as outlined by Commissioner Schmidt, up to 500,000 jobs are at stake. Local battery production is an imperative to safeguard employment. 70% of the value add in the EV powertrain. We need the entire battery value chain localized in Europe. And this is my first and will be my last sentence in this 10-minute speech. The majority of ICE powertrain jobs will become obsolete after 2030, making transformation towards future needs necessary. A mixed technology scenario limits value add and employment impacts until 2040. However, this is driven by hybrid technologies with a, in perspective, less competitive cost position. Last but not least, Western European countries will be best placed to be strongholds in EV production, and Central and Eastern European countries will shape the rundown of the internal combustion engine. Next page, please, Joe. The study sheds light on 3 guiding questions about the EV transition impacts with focus on 7 European countries. Value add, which is revenue minus material cost, and describes the part of the company's individual value creation that directly contributes to the country's economy. Powertrain employment, potential relief and tightening scenarios. And this is the middle row, we analyzed 7 focus countries plus Europe as a whole. We only shed light on powertrain suppliers, very important, not the surrounding framework. And distinctively new is, in that study, we talk about absolute numbers, quantified with a big data model behind, 7 macroeconomic country responses, 199 survey results, and 33 validation senior management interviews. And thanks again to all companies and stakeholders who took their time to bring substance to that study. it's a lot of bottom-up data with a span until 2040 that is base of that study. Thank you very much. Going to the next page. Next page, please, Joe. Perfect. Thank you. 3 market scenarios: a mixed technology scenario, the EV only / fit for 55 plan, and radical scenario are the base for forecasting market developments. Key differentiators are CO2 emission end, Euro 7 regulation rigidity, and governmental incentives, especially in context with COVID recovery plans and charging infrastructure. The EV only scenario, once again, is basically representing the Fit for 55 plan with 0 gram CO2 emissions in 2035. The radical scenario means 0 gram already in 2030. And the mixed technology scenario is around alternative fuel usage and assumes electrification and a strong hybrid market share, not only BEVs, allowing for 50% roughly reduction of CO2 in 2030, close to the Fit for 55 plan, realizing targets by alternative fuels, but not based on tailpipe emissions. I think that is key here. And then going to the next page, to quantify the value add, 5 powertrain technology segments were analyzed. And I'm an engineer, so it's very accurate, it's very engineering driven, and we try to represent the complete powertrain architecture in our study. So once again, very technical, very much bottom up, very solid, very sound. We compare the existing technologies, upper row, with their functional substitute in the future, in the lower row. That means the fuel tank of today is the battery of tomorrow. It's the energy storage. And this is really the differentiating approach compared to previous works in that field. And what we also did, and that is on the right-hand side of that chart, we approached the ICE vehicle technologies with a divestment case logic and the EV technologies respectively with an investment case logic. And we ranked the countries in focus of that study according to the key economic criteria. Going to the next page. Long-term, powertrain value add in Europe will increase, driven by high voltage batteries. And once again, the condition is a full battery value chain localized in Europe, in our countries. The cell production and chemical processes included locally in Europe. The value add increases by 55%. However, whilst employment decreases by 45%. The net effect on employment is driven basically by higher automation levels in these new technologies. The results for the 7 focus countries are, firstly, Germany, Spain, and France are forecasted to generate the most powertrain value add, once again, powertrain value add, in Europe by 2040. France is benefiting from electrification driven by energy prices. Lively discussion these days, at least in German newspapers. Thirdly, Czech Republic remains constant in regards to employment and will absorb volumes through its competitiveness and successfully shape the rundown of the ICE. In all, countries will lose powertrain employment as outlined by Joe in the beginning. Why is that? Once again, higher automation levels in the production processes. And the extrapolation to other European countries is certainly allowed. However, 74% of the car production is covered with that study. So once again, it's a sound way of approaching it, very sound numbers, hopefully. Bringing me to my last page, please. And my closing plaidoyer. The EV-only scenario leads to significant powertrain employment effects after 2030. The radical scenario with even shortened adjustment time. And if you compare the 3 market scenarios, the big transition effort is necessary after 2030. And that is, so to say, the tricky thing here. Until 2030, everything is a kind of cozy. And after 2030, it really accelerates. And I think it relates very well to the speech of Commissioner Schmidt. Even higher stress we see in the radical scenario for sure, which basically puts the trigger already 5 years earlier. Virtually no effects in the mixed technology scenario. However, a relevant transformation of the workforce is imperative in that scenario as well. And once again, my closing plaidoyer, long-term value add in Europe will increase, driven by high voltage batteries, if we have, and only if we have the value chain localized. And once again, it resonated very well with me, what you said, Commissioner Schmidt. Once again, innovation is key, has been key, is key, and will be key for the future. Thank you very much. And I'm handing over to Joe.
Thank you very much for that insightful presentation, Henning. I should just mention, it did lead to a flurry of questions, but I fear we have to move on as we're running quite a bit over time. But just before I let you go, a couple of people have asked about the study. Just to mention, it can be downloaded from CLEPA's website in full. So if you want more insight into Henning's work, that's all available to you. Thank you so much, Henning, for that. Now, as I said, we will be moving on to our panel discussion, which I will begin by introducing today's panelists. Joining us for today is Gabor Baranyai, who is the Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative to the EU from Hungary, which is, of course, an economy which is heavily dependent on the vehicle manufacturing sector. Welcome, Gabor. Then we have with us Lorraine Creed, who is the Director General of the FIA Region 1, which represents mobility clubs across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Welcome, Lorianne. We have Stefan Pischinger, is a professor at the RWTH University in Aachen, and some of you will also know him as the CEO of the engineering services company FEV. Welcome, Stefan. And of course, we have with us Sigrid de Vries, who is, as well as being a former journalist, now CLEPA's Secretary General. Thank you all for joining us today. And just to remind everyone that during this discussion, you can, of course, put questions into the chat, and I'll get to as many of them as possible. But before we head headlong into the discussion, perhaps I'll just get our panelists to make some brief introductory remarks, 2 or 3 minutes each. Can we start with you, Ambassador Baranyai?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. I hope you hear me well. I'd like to thank for the invitation, and also for CLEPA Studies, which a way to put things, I think, into a very nuanced context. I'm very glad that I can be here and share a member state point of view on the whole Fit for 55 package from the transport angle. First of all, just to give you a brief introduction into the Hungarian automotive industry. As Joe has already mentioned, this is a very significant sector in Hungary. Around 5 to 6% of the GDP is directly linked to the sector. It maintains 170,000 jobs, which accounts for about 4% of the total Hungarian workforce. The production value of the sector is 26 billion euros, which equals to around 500,000 cars per year, which again represents around almost 4% of the European car production. And we have around 800 companies in the sector. Hungary is actually the only European country apart from Germany where all the 3 German premium manufacturers, the OEMs, assemble cars, and actually we have around 50 of the top 100 tier 1 automotive suppliers represented in the country. So this is altogether an extremely important sector. The second introductory remark I'd like to make is about the transition towards electromobility. As we heard from the PwC study, the key question will be batteries for the transition. And Hungary actually has already become the 10th largest exporter of electric batteries. Just in the last 3 years, we received around 7 billion euros of FDI in the battery production. These are mainly Asian companies, and the whole supply chain is being built up. So we're quite strong already on the production front. So how about cars? As I mentioned, we have a very extensive manufacturing and research and development basis, and actually the grand players already are introducing electric car production. So it's not only sort of the outgoing small models with low margins that are being produced with ICE engines. It's also becoming sort of a production hub for the electric vehicles. And there has been a significant government support for the acceleration towards the uptake of EVs. So since 2015, we have had a program. We have a pioneering model of issuing green number plates for cars which are either fully electric or plug-in hybrids. The numbers have been going up quite significantly. So just last year it doubled. Now we have 40,000 cars running on the road. So there has been already a transition. So do you want me to reflect upon the real questions now or later on during the
we'll come to that with plenty
okay, thank you.
questions.
So this was my introduction then.
Marvelous. Thank you very much for that. And I say, yeah, we will return to all of those topics in greater detail through the course of this discussion. But while we're doing the introductory round, Lauriane, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, CLEPA, for this study, for inviting us to give a bit of a view of the users. Indeed, for us, fair and just was also at the heart of what we were discussing. We're talking about the transition that will affect all sectors, not only mobility, which is 1/5, as you said, of the emissions, Joe, in the beginning. We will need green energy for all these sectors. And I think heart of the fight will be there. As all players here, we agree with the ambition. The ambition is right. We do, however, have strong concerns about the affordability of this transition phase for the consumers. So our way of dealing with this level of uncertainty, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. We need a goal. We need a final objective that we go to together. We also need to be flexible in the path we're taking to get there. So our, let's say, middle ground was to say we do need to have a zero on the well-to-wheel level. So we want to look a bit broader than only pure electric vehicles. We want to see also all the fuels, all the technologies playing a role at the very least on the path there, because the key concern is the affordability of mobility. So for us, it is about the best technology, the best engine technology. Some of the trips by car might actually also be replaced by other means, by walking, cycling, and so on. That's part of the solution, but also the best fuels. When it comes to pure electric vehicles, I mean, and also hybrids to another extent, there are still big challenges for us as users. The cost is one of them, the charging infrastructure, the performance in extreme weathers, for example. We have a bit of a challenge in cold weather. So for us, it's very important to have a full picture. And what will allow us to do that is to go well to wheel. Just it's a real anecdote at the end of the day, but we have some French members switching their old diesel engines for hybrids. And because of a lack of charging infrastructure, they actually consume up to 10 liters petrol per 100 kilometers. So that's definitely not the goal we want to reach together. So for us, what's important is to have a real picture of what each technology can do. And that's why we're also doing the green NCAP, giving stars to actually the level of emissions, of pollutants emissions, and also the energy efficiency of various engines. So very much looking forward to this discussion. I do think we need to look at life cycle. I don't necessarily, like the commissioner, believe that the life cycle of the ICE is ending all over the world, but that's up to the industry. I am throwing back the ball at the next panelist to have a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauriane. Stefan, would you like to do your brief introductory remarks? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation and having this discussion, Joe and everybody. And yeah, and from the scientific technology point of view, I mean, we've been working for decades on electric vehicles. In 2009, we put 11 vehicles on the street here in Aachen, and it's just a tremendous transformation of technology and industry that's happening. And this is just great, and it will be a very important cornerstone for achieving our future goals of low CO2, and that's also for our company creating so many new job requirements and investment in battery development. And this is great, and it's true that we might even push more for that, also for infrastructure, but also technology. So that's something where I very much agree that we are in a strong transformation that needs innovation and needs boundary condition, needs targets. But at the same time, if really the ultimate goal coming from politics is to achieve this CO2 reduction, that I believe is absolutely necessary, and we cannot be fast enough to achieve that. We cannot leave out just for whatever ideological reasons technologies to achieve this. And I'm deeply convinced that we need all the technologies, and otherwise it will be impossible to achieve the target. Just as Lorenz said, if you look at the whole world vehicle population, which will be 1.6 billion in 2030, even if 15% would be electrified vehicles, or let's take the European community with 270 million, or then 300 million if we have 20, 30, 40% new vehicles, electric vehicles, the rest would be still on the street. And we also don't want to scrape them. That would also not make sense, or it will probably also not be possible. So I believe if we take this target serious, we should be technology-wise open. And for me, the combustion engine worldwide will be a cornerstone, and we need to provide it with CO2 neutral fuel, and that the legislation should also consider, in my view. Otherwise, we will not achieve the target. If really the target of CO2 neutrality is at the top, we should include this, as you say, well-to-wheel or a credit system for renewable fuels. Otherwise, it will be impossible to achieve the target. And if we say goodbye to combustion engine, I mean, we don't, whether we scrape them or not, if we say goodbye to development and engineering, where there's a lot of potential for even cleaner and more efficient engine, other parts of the world are doing this, and it's happening in China as we speak. Lot of transformation and development has already happened because of the strategic decisions that have been made or communicated here. And I don't believe it's right neither for economy, nor it's right for achieving a CO2 neutral future.
Marvelous. Thank you, Stefan. We'll come back to that hot topic of technological openness a little bit later. But finally, last but not least, Sigrid, would you give us your introductory remarks, please?
Yes. Good morning. Thank you, Joe. And also from my side, a warm welcome to everybody. We're really happy as CLEPA that we can stage this important debate today with so many different views and voices also around the table. I just, in my first remarks, like to touch on 3 points that I believe are very important. One is technology ban, the other is the attention for the challenges that are out there, and then also the global dimension. Because indeed, automotive suppliers fully support rapid electrification as an important means to reach climate neutrality. But I think the study that we've presented also today sends a stark warning that an EV-only approach puts really many, many jobs at risk, and the jobs gains that will obviously be there will be in other sectors for different people, often in a different time frame, and they will not compensate also for the losses of jobs. And a further, I think, important point that Henning also made is that these new jobs very much hinge on the assumption of a full battery production chain in Europe, and there are lots of uncertainties around that. There is an alternative way with a mixed technology scenario that builds on rapid electrification combined with other sustainable low and net carbon options. It would make the transition more manageable without compromising on climate goals. And we believe there needs to be more room for this option in the policy debate. Policy decisions that mandate only one technology directly impact consumers and also businesses and EU competitiveness in a very real and very disruptive way. So attention for the challenges. I believe there is not enough attention for the challenges in all of this transition. The emphasis often goes to the positives, and there are many positives, but it doesn't take away that the transformation concerns real people, real businesses, and we need to do more about it. It was mentioned by the commissioner, but nevertheless, we see until now in the Green Deal proposals a lot of focus on targets, on technology preferences, and not so much on the challenges of the transformation, the social dimension, and we are concerned that these challenges risk to be played down. I mean, it was Commissioner Timmermans himself who said there will be a just transition or no transition, but the jury on this really is still out. And then the third point I'd like to bring into the discussion is the global dimension, because we want to keep leadership around the world with EU climate policy. And this only works if it makes economic sense and when there is a business case. And we see this also demonstrated elsewhere in the world. There is broad support for electric vehicles, for electrification, but there is no major global car market, including the US, or China, or Japan, that are opting for technology bans, such as the EU is doing, because there is the realization that transport needs are too diverse for just one solution. So we argue that industry and society must have sufficient time to manage the social aspects of the transition. And with the same can-do ambition to scale up battery production, we need policy incentives to scale up sustainable renewable fuels as a complementing measure. And that way we can really have all technology solutions play their part in reducing emissions, which will also then help sustain competitiveness and jobs here in Europe, but also in the perspective of the global dimension, the global market. Joe.
Thank you very much for that, Sigrid. So now that we've all set out our stalls, we can jump into the discussion itself. Just want to say to all of the panelists that please don't feel you have to wait until you're called to join the conversation. I know it's a little bit difficult over Zoom to sort of jump in, but if you have something you want to say to someone else on the panel, please do say so, and you can leave yourselves off mute if you like, if that's easier, so that you can have a sort of free-flowing conversation. But let's start with you, Sigrid. We've heard a lot about the PwC study and the scenarios that it's been painting. These are, very serious scenarios. What do you think, though, is the future for European suppliers if the current Fit for 55 package that the Commission is proposing goes through unchanged? Is it really as bad as that paper showed?
Well, it's certainly a tremendously huge challenge, Joe, because the time for change is so short. And what we do see, of course, there are many opportunities, and the Commissioner mentioned it. I think all of our panelists by now also mentioned it. The transition is on its way. Businesses also find new opportunities in new areas of business. That's all ongoing, but the scale is not on par with what is going to be left out and going to be shed. So there is a structural change with moving away from combustion engine technology. This is going to go away, it's not going to come back, but the new parts of the business, the new economy, if you like, still is in process of being built up. And this is not on par. It's a huge challenge in a very short amount of time. And many businesses, and hence also many people and livelihoods, will be impacted severely, and we shouldn't downplay this risk. It's there. It needs to be managed, supported. Indeed, policymakers can support by funding, but I think it's also very, very important to say that just focusing on reskilling and upskilling is not a magic wand. It's not going to provide a solution for everything. And therefore, the policy decisions that are now on the table to be taken, to be decided by the European Parliament and by the EU member states are still so very important. We're not just talking here yet about adaptation and mitigating and doing damage control. We have still policy decisions to be made that will be fundamental and that will determine a very important part of this industry, the future of it. And there we have options. We see that also around the world. We see some parts of industry going heavily into electrification only, but they're also in a way betting on that business strategy to fly. We believe there need to be more options because of the many uncertainties when it comes to infrastructure or to material sourcing or to geopolitical events. Society needs a safety net, needs options, and that's what we're arguing for. So yes, there is always a great future for this industry, but the face will change and it will impact many real businesses and many real people on the ground. And we should not walk around that. We should really take that into account and deal with that as well.
Gabor,
I'm looking forward also what the ambassador has to say to that, because he is in the driving seat when it comes to taking decisions. Yes.
We're of the same mind. I was just about to go to Ambassador Varani and ask you, this gap that Sigrid outlines between the new technologies coming online and the phasing out of the old technologies and those people who are stuck in between. Do you get a sense when you talk to the Commission that they understand what the impact would be in Hungary, for example?
Thank you. I think not. Definitely not. I think there are at least two fundamental problems with the Commission's proposal in this context. One is who is the final consumer in, just look at the average Commission official. He or she would be relatively high on living in the Benelux countries, not traveling too much. For them or for many people, money is available, technology is available, and it's sort of like a lifestyle choice. Instead of a BMW 7, I opt for a hybrid or something. But for many people, this is not only a question of lifestyle, but access to basic mobility for job services, etc. So I think this aspect is more or less overlooked in the whole discussion. And actually, this is turning into a very politically hot issue in certainly in some of the Visegrad 4 countries. And we have, of course, seen various other events, such as the Gilets jaunes movement some years ago in France. So I think there's a fundamental problem there. The second is this technological non-neutrality. This is not only characteristic to this particular proposal, so on the CO2 from cars proposal, but many of the Commission's proposals are extremely prescriptive. They believe they know where the right technology is. The technology is, if it's not available, it will be just in a number of years. We have to be ambitious, there's the buzzword, and ambition will bring solutions in almost automatically. Also, in other fields, such as in energy sources, hydrogen, whether or not can you produce hydrogen from nuclear, and if it's not super green hydrogen, then of course you shouldn't be able to use it for your charging of your vehicles. I mean, how stupid is that? I mean, honestly. So we're facing a lot of these very stubborn sort of ideological cornerstones in the issue. And apart from this sort of affordability and economic sense perspective, there's a third one, which is a very sort of Central or Eastern European perspective, notably that a very forced, very quick EV transition, even though Hungary is doing its own share, will lead to an influx of second-hand cars, an almost uncontrollable influx of all the diesel cars and all the petrol cars to the Central and Eastern parts of Europe, which actually will tilt the balance towards a very ungreen transition, because if all of a sudden all these older cars will be dumped on our part of Europe, and the people there are not capable of buying fancy EVs or plug-in hybrids, then we get stuck. We get stuck, and it will be very difficult to get rid of that legacy. So we have a number of problems, and if you want me to, I can of course touch upon how this plays out in the council discussions.
Yeah, well, as I say, we'll return to this, but you raise a very interesting point there about, you talk about those officials in Brussels having the lifestyle choice to choose an EV or an hybrid or something like that. And Lauriane, I thought this is an interesting point that we haven't perhaps talked enough about, which is that this package also has an impact on affordability for consumers. It changes the options that are available to ordinary drivers around Europe, not all of whom have the kind of funds to be one of the pioneers in the EV world. Are you concerned about this and what it means to the average consumer?
Yes, indeed, that's a key concern. I mean, the overall idea of the Commission and of the defenders, let's say, of a purely EV strategy is to say that in the second-hand market you could get a cheaper electric vehicle. But the question around the lifetime of the battery, the questions around what do I do in the transition, I think Sigrid mentioned the e-fuels, but in the next 10 years, people are not going to change their vehicle. It's an important asset. It's an investment for many families that you don't change from one day to the next. And what we see in our clubs is a lot of people uncertain, postponing buying a car because they don't really know what they will be able to drive where and what is the actual current choice. So for them, it's a bit tricky to make a choice on the next vehicle. And again, in certain use cases, for example, the hybrids are not delivering what they could deliver because of a lack of infrastructure. So it is really a tricky decision for now to invest in a car. Obviously, the European Commission thought about the social impacts and had this idea of a fund to compensate some of the poorest Europeans. How it would work is a big question, because it should also be funded by having transport in ETS, which is something that will be debated as well and will be discussed. So there are really still pending questions on how do we make it possible without hurting the most vulnerable. And it is even more so crucial now in the pandemic times, where we saw a lot of families getting their livelihood actually diminished because of the pandemic. So that is a key, and that is also key for acceptance from the public's perspective. It is not a golden bubble that people are living in, so it is necessary for them to move from A to B, and it is an important investment. And we've seen in the recent years that sometimes they invested in a technology which was deemed okay in terms of CO2, and which turned out to be actually much worse than it was advertised. So there's a question of trust.
Indeed, actually, a question has popped in on that topic. Quite a good question. Anyone can come in on this. If people are uncertain about which car to buy, asks Sarah Walker, how would a mixed scenario help give them that certainty? Doesn't it just prolong the uncertainty? Which I suppose is a good question. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, it is a good question. It is indeed depending on what is available on the market. What we're advocating for is that at least in the transition, you get a multitude of options to match your needs. So that basically you don't have to go for one certain technologies. You could also go to sharing more. But that's also for us quite key to make sure that you can still use your vehicles for the coming years by having maybe carbon neutral fuels as well, while still keeping our objectives to be climate neutral. So I don't think that, let's say, the objective of zero CO2 by the Commission would actually give 100% certainty neither, because the models are not necessarily there, the infrastructure is not necessarily there. So it does give an objective. It does not necessarily on the ground give you the certainty that people need to make that investment. Sigrid, yeah.
Yeah, and if I can just echo that and also maybe add another point, in the end, it's about what we use in these vehicles. It's about using green energy or green fuels. And then the choice or prolonging uncertainty is no longer the case, because we would be moving forward to climate neutrality, whatever the technology that we're using. And that's exactly what we are arguing for. There should be technology openness, and the biggest effort should be made to make energy green and to make fuels green, because an electric vehicle currently is in the regulatory dimension seen as zero emissions, which it isn't if it's not running on green energy. And at the same token, a combustion engine vehicle can be running on green fuels and therefore be climate neutral. And this aspect is entirely missing currently. And indeed, we should move to well-to-wheel and at some point also life cycle analysis in this whole spectrum. Otherwise, we won't meet our climate targets. And we're focusing a lot today on employment and on economic and manufacturing fabric. And that's incredibly important, competitiveness too. But in the end, what we're all around the table agreed on is that we want to meet these climate targets. So let's find the way there.
I'm sure the taxonomy that you mentioned there, Sigrid, will be will come under greater scrutiny as we go through this this process. Stefan, I wanted to bring you in here because you look like you wanted. Did you want to jump in on that point? Because I was going to come to.
I mean,
go ahead.
I completely agree, and it's somehow also difficult to understand for aviation. We do also politically accept these synthetic fuels and give them credit and allow it. And so I don't see a reason why we need to ban the combustion engine. The combustion engine is not a problem. It's the fuel. And Ambassador Barnier talked about hydrogen. There's hydrogen engines for application also have a big future perspective, CO2 neutral, and the customer has the choice, and he has a choice based on the vehicles, but also based, as you said, on infrastructure. But in the end, we also need the energy here to be zero, be CO2 neutral, and get all that electricity in place. And I read this question about price. I mean, we made a study with below 4 cents per kilo, 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour, and we managed to get a liter of diesel in the future by synthetic fuels made in Middle East with North Africa for around €1 per liter, and the future can even be lower. We know that some areas we are already at 2 cents or even 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour electricity, but that's not in Germany or Europe. That's in other areas where you have much higher efficiency of photovoltaic. Because of the stronger sun, we have 2.5 to 3 times the output of electrical energy. That energy has to come to Europe. Europe is an energy import country, and it will stay for a long time. If we want to be CO2 neutral, we have to find a global solution. And to get this energy into Europe, liquid fuels, maybe also hydrogen, some talk about ammonia, but there's various options. Let the technology find with a fair evaluation the best solution, and there's maybe several in parallel. We cannot leave out the solution. It's economically, I think it's already making sense now. But of course, if you have a ban on a technology, nobody will invest in it. If you say 2035, everything stops, nobody will invest in the fuels for this, because just for the existing fleet, it will not happen now.
Ambassador Barnier, I wanted to come back to you briefly. You talked about the rush into EVs that the current policy prescriptions seem to be pushing us towards. I suppose the counter argument would be that if you look at the market for the last year or so, it looks like consumers are choosing a sort of headlong rush into electric vehicles, and that the market itself is choosing. If that continues to be the case, what do you want to see for companies in Hungary that are stuck in the middle of this supply chain? Is the reskilling, for example, that the commissioner talked about, is that something you think is a viable bridge between these technologies?
Thank you. Apparently, I'm not a technical expert. We do build up. You specifically mentioned Hungary. We do invest significantly in reskilling some of the people, and some parts of the auto industry will be doing that by themselves. Apparently, that there will be losses. These are being calculated now. But we're also moving into the direction of building up a full electric powertrain supply chain. I think the sort of industrial problem varies maybe us less than as governments than the industry, and this is probably what I can see in the council discussion from sort of the Central European perspective, that we're more concerned about the social dimension, which is not necessarily manifest itself through employment losses, but limited access to mobility for the people who do need this kind of mobility, and also the ensuing sort of lock-in effect of old ICE cars rather than moving towards this flashy green future. So I think the discussion really in council has been, I mean, the social dimension has been mainly about affordability rather than the tremendous loss of employment. Of course, that's also relevant. But really the main focus has been about the demand side, management of the problem.
Yes, the impact on the consumer. Stefan, I was going to ask you. You talked about there being life in the combustion engine yet, and in some form or another, or at least there being the possibility of us having better and cleaner combustion engines as we go through this transition. I suppose some people would argue that that it's a zero-sum game, that you have R&D and you have a certain amount of R&D spend, and if you were to put that towards ICE development now, you are not putting it towards future technologies, and therefore, the transition is suffering. What would you say to that?
Yes, there may be some argument. Clearly, in industry, we cannot follow always at the same time every technology with the same intensiveness, and I think the push and the technology effort putting into electromobility and batteries, where I completely agree also what the Commissioner said before, that we have been too slow in this, and this is absolutely necessary. Also, the transition has to happen fast. But the world is diverse, and there is companies also in Europe that export cars with engines to other countries in the world. There's other applications, and the market will fix it, and focus will also happen. You just don't need to force it by law to ban something. I think we can leave it with the right boundary conditions regarding CO2 targets, where to wheel, and giving credit to the fuels. This thing will happen itself. Of course, the prioritization must happen. We cannot develop everything at the same time, and that is okay. And the variety of engine has been reduced anyway. But I can tell you, in other countries in the world, there is new developments in engines going on. These engines will have efficiencies that Europe will not be able to compete with. So we will be in the situation maybe in 2030 that we are importing engines from other countries in the world because our engines are not competitive. Now, that may be okay if we want to ban them anyway, but then we will also not be to export to the other countries. So the question is, do we leave it to economical boundary conditions, leave it free, or do we need to ban it? I don't think we need to ban it. We just need to set the boundaries right, and then it will decide. Maybe actively, of course, we have to set boundaries, incentives for electromobility. We have to build up the infrastructure. Yes, and we have to push for these e-fuels. There was a question, where do the fuels come from if we import them? They will come exactly from those countries who export the oil today. And this is where we have to start. We have to stop them from bringing the oil. That's the only way to stop CO2 emission, is where the source is, because the oil otherwise will be used somewhere else. So we have to commonly find a way for them to put a plug on the oil drills and produce from sun synthetic renewable fuels or hydrogen, and then have a complete ecosystem around the world with renewable energy.
You raise a very interesting prospect there, that we could have just as many ICE powertrain producers, just they won't be in Europe, they'd be elsewhere, and then beyond the reach of the Commission's programs. I wanted to just address one of the issues that's been asked quite a bit in the chat by some of our viewers, and perhaps Lauriane, we can speak of this, and that's the issue of autonomous driving, which we haven't discussed very much, and how big a part that has to play in this transition, whether that will be the accelerator. Now, personally, I think that's still quite a long way away, but I wondered from a consumer perspective, is that the sort of inflection point that people are waiting for, do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of unknown. I won't speak for the industry on that one because I don't know. I do see a lot of trends. The biggest and the most pressing for us right now is connectivity, actually, rather than automation, to be honest. And there's a big potential in optimizing the trips, in optimizing the use of the vehicles and so on. I don't think necessarily automation and greening will go hand in hand. But again, in terms of the lead time for the industry, I'll hand over to you, Sigrid, because that's an unknown for me.
Yes. Sigrid, are you hearing about autonomous from CLEPA's members as something that is in the near future rather than far away?
Well, connectivity is here, it's all around us. Automation and many driver assist features are also around us, and they will be increasingly ready and come onto the markets and make driving safer and also more convenient and increase efficiency. So indeed, a lot of these benefits actually play out in the green dimension, and also in our lives becoming smarter and more efficient. So we will see that, but I think indeed automation is a bit further down the road still. But you see the developments go hand in hand also with vehicle architectures changing because of EV vehicles. There is a whole new infrastructure architecture needed within the vehicle, and that also brings in all these the electronic dimensions, and the smart connectivity, automated features are built into that. So that's another huge transformation. I mean, as an industry, we're almost in a perfect storm. We have COVID, and the fallout of COVID, of the pandemic, is not only that many a lot less cars are being built, so also components and systems are being less produced. So that is something to cope with, because your revenues go down, and therefore your profits, and therefore your ability to invest in R&I and R&D, which is so important for an advanced economy as Europe is. And one of the fallouts is constraints in the supply chain when it comes to chips, semiconductors, but also other materials, shortages. Combine this with a growing demand for chips because of connectivity, automation, also electrification, and also a growing demand for materials that go into batteries. There's a lot of stress, a lot of constraints, and then the enormous regulatory pressure that is coming from the green side, because let's not kid ourselves there. You mentioned market-driven developments when it comes to electric vehicles, but of course, de facto, this is a regulation-driven trend, which consumers are enthusiastically picking up on now, those that can afford it, and where it's possible because of an existing infrastructure and so on. So I mean, the caveats already start building up there in my answer. So the perfect storm, this transformation, this transition, it's huge, and we need to work on all ends. Skills, reskilling, upskilling, again, very important. CLEPA was one of the founders of the Automotive Skills Pact initiative that the Commissioner also mentioned, because our industry is heavily involved in reskilling, upskilling people. But as I said before, it's not a magic wand. We need action at many levels, and that's what industry is in at the moment. And I mean, things are not simple. The world is complex, and I think debates like this one maybe help a little bit, creating more understanding for that, and therefore then also considering giving sufficient time to take everybody along and keep everybody on board.
It's interesting you mentioned this perfect storm, which has prompted a couple of questions on on a topic I was about to move on to, which is China and Asian manufacturers. And Jorn, for example, asks, how will the advantage of China's development in electric vehicles and fuel cells disturb EU economics and market in the future? And I suppose the point being that we can talk, for hours about the EU's program, but if we have, the world's biggest car market, and perhaps the US as well, so perhaps the world's two biggest car markets going headlong into EVs and choosing a particular technology, does the EU even have any autonomy, so to speak, when it comes to talking about, which technologies will win out in the future?
I think if you were asking me, they very much have diversity front of their minds too. They go heavy into hydrogen, electrification, and you see different economies going that way, including Europe, and that is absolutely needed and necessary, but they will not go for just one solution. If you have to serve with transport and mobility the hinterland of China, you can't rely on electrification only. Of course, from an industrial policy vantage point, it's very understandable what they're doing, but it's not a single solution policy that they are implementing currently. Maybe Stefan has something to say on that too.
No, I completely agree, and I think worldwide competition, that's what I mean, is a key role. And clearly, by stepping too late in battery development here in Europe, we have lost some grounds which we can regain. We are good in research, but in production we have to scale up, and so we have to. It's a worldwide fight, and not only on the battery, on the complete vehicle infrastructure, in particular on connectivity and also HMI. The development speed of cars, and to really produce attractive electric vehicles for the Chinese market as well, that they accept and can compete with Chinese local brands that are also pushing to enter our European market. So that is the base of competition, and that should happen. But that will also take place then, as you said, Sigrid, on other areas where China is clearly continuing to develop combustion engine and hybrids and serial hybrids and hydrogen engines, and of course fuel cells. So that is up to every company to make its decision how to, what role to play in this competition. But if there is a certain technology banned in Europe, it will make the situation more difficult for a company here to be worldwide competitive on that, because one market then drops out for that.
Yeah. Absolutely. We're rapidly running out of time, as is always the case with these discussions. But before I hand back over to Sigrid, Ambassador, I just wanted to ask you a very quick, very brief question at the end, whether you think, you talked about how, for example, Central European countries have a different view on this than other member states. Do you think the French presidency will change anything, or do you expect a similar debate over the next few months?
I think the French presidency handles this issue with double caution. I mean, apparently the official line is that the whole Fit for 55 package is a package. So before we actually decide on the CO2 from cars regulation, we have to look at whether or not the ETS will be extended to road transport, or what the final big numbers will be. Apparently, France as a country has had a fairly strong opinion on this subject, and I already mentioned the Gilets jaunes movement and some other political factors. There's an election coming up in France, so there are a number of factors which I think militate in the direction that the presidency will be quite cautious, and not only because of their own sort of position. Of course, they are supposed to be neutral, and I'm sure they will be, but also because it's a very divisive issue. I think what will be absolutely critical in this whole discussion is the position of Germany. There are, of course, the super progressive countries who want to cut IC cars from 2030. There are very few ones who actually argue that we shouldn't have this final date of 2035 at all. So probably there is a more or less broad majority or a perceivable majority behind the Commission's original timetable. But some big countries, may move and may shift things. So from a sort of certain Central European perspective, we're, I think, up against an uphill struggle to defend the rather ambitious proposal of the Commission. So in a way, things don't look that bright from an industrial point of view.
Well, one to watch over the next few months. We've run completely out of time, so it remains for me to thank Ambassador Branier, Stefan, Lorraine for being with us, and just finally over to Sigrid for some final closing thoughts. And thank you everyone for being with us.
No, thank you, Joe. It also just for me to thank everybody joining our event today online. Thank the speakers, thank the panelists, and also thank you, Joe, for excellent moderation. I think everything has been said, and thank you so much. So let's close. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Sigrid. And yes, once again, thanks everyone for joining. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of your questions, but such is the nature of these events, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.